During the 1790s, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton held sharply conflicting views on foreign and domestic policies and on constitutional interpretation. Today, many label Hamilton's views as conservative and Jefferson's as liberal, and see their conflict as a harbinger of contemporary battles. Yet the specific issues over which they argued are not relevant to modern Americans, and their views have little to do with current definitions of conservative and liberal. Still, their conflicts are relevant to us, albeit not in the ways we might think. So, in today's lecture, we're going to talk about kind of the confusions about Jefferson and Hamilton. Now, Washington had selected Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton for his two most important cabinet positions as part of a general effort to maintain sectional balance, not political ideological balance within the new national government. The split that developed between the two was primarily over two issues: government fiscal policies and definitions of neutrality as a result of the war between England and France. Now, as Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton believed that the most pressing problems in the United States were financial. The country needed to establish credit at home and abroad if the new government was to work. Hamilton thus proposed that the new national government assumed all state Revolutionary War debts, combine them with the national debt, and fund both at par value via a new bond issue. He also proposed new taxes on imports and some domestically produced items to pay government debts, and the establishment of a combined private and government-controlled national bank to serve as a depository for treasury notes and fiscal agent for the government, with its own banknotes to be considered legal tender. Now, these actions would tie the wealthy merchant and financial class to the success of the new government, while providing a new circulating medium, establishing the credit of the government and increasing its power and prestige. Now, the opposition to Hamilton was at first led by James Madison, not Jefferson. Later, Jefferson opposed the establishment of the national bank on the grounds that the power to do so was not specifically enumerated in Article 1 of the Constitution. Hamilton, however, argued that the power was constitutional via the necessary and proper clause in Article 1. Washington sided with Hamilton, but a serious split had emerged. Now, the division over foreign affairs became apparent in 1793 when the French Revolution turned radical with the creation of the French Republic, the execution of the king, and the institution of the Reign of Terror. This resulted in the outbreak of general war in Europe, pitting Republican France against Britain and all the other major monarchies of Europe. Now, everyone in the cabinet agreed that the United States should remain neutral, but a treaty of alliance was in effect with France dating back to the Revolutionary War. Further, the question arose of which country U.S. neutrality should favor. Hamilton argued for neutrality favoring Britain, while Jefferson advocated neutrality favoring the sister republic of France. Now, at first, Washington took a middle-of-the-road position, but by 1795, he sided with Hamilton by agreeing to the Jay Treaty with England. And in an effort to avoid war, the treaty acceded to the British definition of neutral rights in return for British evacuation of posts on U.S. territory and peace. Now, the Jay Treaty also led to a public uproar against it and the formation of the first two national political parties, the Federalists under Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson and Madison. Now, this wasn't the end of things. Eventually, the split begins to widen between the two. And in the presidential election of 1796, Federalist John Adams narrowly defeated Jefferson, who became the vice president. Now, the problem is that these two men were on opposing sides. Now, during Adams' presidency, the dispute between the two political parties became white hot as the United States engaged in an undeclared naval war with France as a result of the Jay Treaty. The Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts directed against the Democratic Republicans, while Jefferson and Madison responded with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. threatening nullification of the acts and other unconstitutional laws. Now, the specific issues addressed by these laws and resolutions are of little or no relevance to us today, but many argue that the conflicting beliefs behind the issues are significant, though not in the ways we might think. As we've noted, Jefferson argued for a narrow, a narrow interpretation of the Constitution with regard to national power versus state power, while Hamilton argued for a broad interpretation via the necessary and proper clause. Now, this argument over state versus national power is a constant in U.S. history, right down to this day. It pitted Federalists against Democratic Republicans throughout this era, and then Democrats against Whigs in the 1830s and 40s, and then Democrats against Republicans even in the modern era today. And in this case, however, the positions in the 1790s were reversed from what they would later be and still are today. At the time, the supposedly aristocratic Hamilton argued for more national power, and the supposedly democratic Jefferson argued for less, whereas since the 1930s, Jefferson's liberal disciples have argued for more and their conservative opponents for less. Also relevant in this regard was Jefferson's welcoming of the French Revolution, while Hamilton and his followers abhorred it and favored the British. Hamilton favored the British because British trade was essential to provide revenues for the government via import taxes, and because British credit and manufactured goods were necessary for his vision of U.S. development. Now, at the same time, Jefferson's opposition was based not so much on his love for Republican France, but on the fact that he did not support the Hamiltonian domestic program, and thus did not believe that the United States needed British trade or credit. He also feared dependency on the powerful British and desired to use a French connection as a counterweight. Now, it's also true that in many ways Hamilton was not really aristocratic and Jefferson was not really democratic. Both men believed strongly in republicanism, meaning representative government as opposed to monarchy. But the questions here were who would be the representatives and who would they represent? Now, despite his reputation, Jefferson was not a Democrat who believed in majority rule. He was a slaveholder and aristocrat who believed in property qualifications for voting. And he also saw a decentralized agrarian society of self-sufficient yeoman farmers as the best way to preserve liberty. And he believed in the politics of deference, hardly a democratic notion. Hamilton, on the other hand, was no aristocrat. He was an illegitimate child from the West Indies, and he believed that centralized power was necessary to preserve liberty from both internal chaos and external threat. He also believed that self-interest rules human nature and should be used to create such centralized power by linking of the wealthy commercial and financial interests to those of the national government. Jefferson saw self-interest as evil. Now, the specific issues facing Jefferson and Hamilton and their disagreements have little to do with the issues we as a nation face now, yet their disagreement is still relevant to us on multiple levels. First, the disagreement over the interpretation of the Constitution and national versus state power has been a constant throughout U.S. history down to the present day. Here, it's Hamilton's view that contemporary liberals embrace, and Jefferson's that contemporary conservatives embrace. Second, Jefferson's agrarianism and aristocratic emphasis on property qualifications for voting possessed a strong democratic streak in the agrarian American world in the 1790s. Now, at the time, the United States was overwhelmingly populated by farmers who owned their own land and thus possessed sufficient property to vote. Hamilton's commercial, manufacturing, and urban vision possesses an unwitting democratic streak in the opportunities for advancement it would provide in the future. Now, the conflicting views of Hamilton and Jefferson on human nature and the role of self-interest in government also have continued relevance. Hamilton had a more pessimistic view of human nature, which he saw as motivated by self-interest. He sought to harness the self-interest by tying the wealthy and powerful to the new government. Jefferson saw self-interest and the mutual dependence of government and commercialism as leading to corruption and the destruction of liberty. He also believed strongly in republican virtue and political disinterest, rather than self-interest, as appropriate for politics in a republican society and as the key to preserving liberty. Now, although Jefferson's words still resonate with our democratic beliefs today, it's Hamilton's vision and views regarding a politics based on self-interest that would become our reality. The concept of republican virtue, as central to politics, would disappear with the deaths of the founding fathers and the replacement by a new generation of political leaders with different ideas. Now, Hamilton's death did not result in the immediate demise of the Federalist Party, but it left the party leaderless and geographically isolated in New England, while Western expansion brought in more supporters of Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. Jefferson's and his successor, James Addison, succeeded in wooing moderate Federalists into the Democratic Republican Party by agreeing to some Federalist ideas, including a protective tariff for American industry and the chartering of a second national bank. Now, during the War of 1812, the remaining extreme Federalists further isolated themselves by opposing the war, and at the Harvard Convention, hypocritically calling for states' rights and virtually threatening secession. Now, news of American military victories and the negotiation of a peace treaty ending the war with Britain led to the party's disgrace and collapse. Now, in the election of 1820, the Democratic-Republican candidate James Monroe ran unopposed, and the nation entered an era of one-party rule, during which the Democratic-Republican Party encompassed the views of both Hamilton and Jefferson. Now, that, of course, could not and would not continue. The Hamiltonian-Jefferson disagreements would soon reassert themselves in the creation of the so-called second two-party political system during the 1820s and 1830s. So this is the end of today's lecture on Jefferson and Hamilton's views and some of the problems that persisted during their time. Now, before we leave, here's a couple questions that you should probably consider while working on your discussion this week. How are the conflicts between Hamilton and Jefferson relevant to us today? And where else in U.S. history do we tend to anachronistically project our contemporary values onto the past? So again, this is History 101 Online with Professor Hasselman, and that's the end of today's lecture.